King Æthelred II, often referred to as the Unready, ruled England from 978 until his death in 1016. His reign, spanning nearly 4 decades, was marked by significant challenges, including internal political instability, external threats from Viking invasions, and a reputation for ineffective leadership. Æthelred's nickname, the Unready, reflects both the perceived failure of his kingship and his inability to effectively address the many crises that threatened the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. However, this epithet can be misleading, as it fails to account for the complex and multifaceted nature of Æthelred's reign, which was shaped by numerous internal and external factors. Despite the struggles and setbacks that characterized Æthelred's time on the throne, his reign was not devoid of important achievements. His early years saw efforts to strengthen royal authority, and his reign saw both military engagement and reform, though with mixed success. The reign of Æthelred was also defined by the growing influence of the Viking invasions, particularly the Danish forces led by Sweyn Forkbeard and later Canute the Great, which would come to dominate the last years of his rule. Ultimately, Æthelred's inability to resolve the Viking threat and his troubled relationship with his nobles and the church would lead to his downfall and exile. Æthelred II was born around 966, the second son of King Edgar the Peaceful and Queen Æthelthryth. His father, Edgar, had consolidated much of England under a single, unified monarchy, and was remembered for his effective rule, which was marked by peace and prosperity. However, after Edgar's death in 975, Æthelred's succession to the throne was not without complications. Æthelred's elder half-brother, Edward the Martyr, became king upon Edgar's death, but was murdered in 978 under suspicious circumstances. The murder of Edward, for which Æthelred's stepmother, Æthelthryth, is often blamed, led to Æthelred's ascension to the throne. Æthelred was only about 12 years old when he succeeded his brother, and his reign began under difficult circumstances. He inherited a kingdom that was not only politically unstable, but also vulnerable to external threats, particularly from Viking invaders who had been attacking England intermittently since the late 8th century. The legacy of Æthelred's early years was shaped by his youth, inexperience, and the challenges posed by both internal political strife and external military threats. Early in his reign, Æthelred was essentially a figurehead, with real power resting in the hands of his advisors, regents, and nobles. One of the defining features of Æthelred's reign was the continuous and escalating threat posed by Viking invasions, particularly from Danish forces. The Vikings, who had been raiding England since the late 8th century, had a deep and lasting impact on the political and social landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. By the time Æthelred ascended to the throne, the Viking threat had become a persistent and existential challenge. The Vikings had invaded England on several occasions during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, but Æthelred's reign saw the return of large-scale invasions. In 980, shortly after Æthelred became king, the Vikings launched a significant attack on England, starting a new wave of raids. These invasions were particularly devastating for Æthelred, as the Danish forces led by Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark, and later Canute the Great, were able to exploit the divisions within England and the weakness of Æthelred's leadership. In response to these invasions, Æthelred initially relied on paying large sums of money, known as the Danegeld, to the Viking raiders in order to buy peace and avoid further destruction. While this strategy may have temporarily delayed the Viking onslaught, it was also deeply unpopular with the Anglo-Saxon nobility and the people, as it drained the kingdom's resources without ensuring long-term security. The repeated payments to the Vikings were seen as a sign of weakness, and they only fueled the sense of dissatisfaction with Æthelred's rule. The failure of Æthelred's strategy of paying off the Vikings came to a head in 991, when a large Viking army landed in England under the leadership of Olaf Tryggvason and Sweyn Forkbeard. Æthelred's army was unable to defeat the invaders, and the kingdom was forced to pay an enormous sum in Danegeld to secure peace. The payment, which amounted to £10,000, was seen as a humiliating concession and marked the beginning of a long series of payments to Viking invaders. By the end of the 10th century, the Viking threat was not only ongoing, but intensifying. In 1013, after years of escalating raids and conflict, Æthelred's inability to effectively combat the Vikings led to his flight to Normandy, where he sought refuge with his family. The Viking forces, under Sweyn Forkbeard, had successfully taken control of much of England, and Æthelred was ultimately forced into exile. One of the most controversial and divisive events during Æthelred's reign was the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002. Faced with a growing Viking threat and an increasing number of Danish settlers in England, Æthelred ordered the execution of all Danish men in England on November 13th, 1002, the feast day of St. Brice. This massacre was part of Æthelred's broader strategy to eliminate the perceived threat of the Danes within his kingdom and to remove those he saw as loyal to the Viking raiders. The massacre, which reportedly resulted in the deaths of hundreds or even thousands of Danish men, was met with outrage both within England and across the Viking world. The Viking response was swift and brutal, with Sweyn Forkbeard launching a retaliatory raid on England. This act of violence further alienated the Danish people in England and ultimately deepened the conflict between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. The St. Brice's Day massacre was a turning point in Æthelred's reign, as it marked the beginning of more direct and intense conflict with the Vikings. While Æthelred may have believed that he was acting in the best interests of his kingdom, the massacre only exacerbated the existing tensions and led to more Viking attacks and greater instability in England. Æthelred's attempts to appease the Vikings through tribute payments had failed, and his decision to resort to violence had only escalated the crisis. Æthelred's exile to Normandy in 1013 was the culmination of a long period of Viking success in England. After Sweyn Forkbeard's death in 1014, Æthelred was able to return to England with the support of his loyalists. However, his return did not signal the restoration of peace or stability. The Viking threat continued to loom large, and Æthelred's reign was characterized by a series of battles and political maneuverings aimed at regaining control of the kingdom. Despite his return to the throne, Æthelred's ability to deal with the Viking invasions was limited. His inability to achieve a decisive victory over the Vikings was compounded by internal divisions within the Anglo-Saxon nobility, which undermined his authority. Æthelred's efforts to secure the kingdom through military action were largely unsuccessful, and his reign continued to be defined by the ongoing struggle for survival against the Viking forces. The final years of Æthelred's reign saw the rise of Canute the Great, the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, as the dominant figure in Anglo-Saxon England. Canute's military and political acumen, combined with his ability to gain the support of the English nobility, made him a formidable adversary. In 1016, Æthelred's forces clashed with those of Canute at the Battle of Ashington, a decisive battle in which Æthelred's army was defeated. Æthelred died later that year, and Canute succeeded him as King of England. Cnut's ascension to the throne marked the end of Æthelred's troubled reign. Despite Æthelred's attempts to resist Viking domination, the forces of Canute ultimately triumphed, and England came under the control of a Danish king for the first time in its history. The Anglo-Saxon monarchy, once the cornerstone of England's political identity, was replaced by Danish rule, which would endure under Canute and his successors. Æthelred II's legacy is a complex and contested one. His failure to effectively respond to the Viking threat, coupled with his decision to pay the Danegeld, has contributed to his reputation as an ineffective and indecisive ruler. His actions, such as the St. Brice's Day massacre, further tarnished his legacy, as they intensified the conflict with the Danes and contributed to his eventual downfall. However, Æthelred's reign was not without merit. His efforts to defend England against Viking invasions, though ultimately unsuccessful, reflected a determination to protect the kingdom from external threats. Furthermore, his efforts to centralize royal power and strengthen the monarchy, though incomplete, laid the groundwork for the political and administrative reforms that would come under his son, Edmund Ironside, and later Cnut the Great. In the end, Æthelred the Unready is remembered as a tragic figure whose reign was defined by struggle and failure. His inability to secure the kingdom from Viking invasions and his troubled relationship with his nobles and the church left a lasting impact on Anglo-Saxon England, paving the way for the Danish conquest and the end of the Anglo-Saxon monarchy.